If you've been wounded by someone who refuses to take responsibility, if you've spent months or even years waiting for an apology that never came, then you are standing at the edge of one of life's most painful and silent psychological battles. This is the battle between maintaining your self-respect and longing for validation from someone who may never give it. The pain is compounded when the person who harmed you does not feel remorse in the way most people understand it. A narcissist does not apologize because they recognize the depth of their wrongdoing. They apologize only when the stability of their carefully curated internal music world is threatened, when their sense of control or image is at music risk. And today you are going to understand exactly why that is music and what you must do if you ever want to hear those words you were so desperately denied. Music, this is not about manipulation. This is about reclaiming your personal power, restoring your dignity, and learning the precise behaviors that compel accountability in a personality that is designed to avoid it. What you are about to learn works music not because it is cruel, but because it is rooted in truth, a truth that most people are too polite or too hopeful to confront. Many people like to believe that apologies are born from sudden awakenings of empathy, that one day the person who harmed them simply wakes up, feels the weight of what they did, and comes forward, humbled, remorseful, and sincere. That idea is emotionally comforting. It soothes the pain of rejection and abandonment, yet it is psychologically naive. In reality, most genuine apologies, especially from individuals with narcissistic traits, music, do not emerge from compassion or self-reflection at all. They emerge from consequence, from external forces that make the cost of remaining the same unbearable. Human beings, even those with deeply entrenched narcissistic patterns, music change not because they suddenly recognize the pain they have caused, but because the cost of staying the same exceeds the cost of transformation. Music, the catalyst, is never moral clarity alone. It is music, the undeniable friction created when their fantasy self-image collides with reality. A narcissistic personality is structured to avoid shame at all costs, to preserve a grandiose self-image, and to maintain control over how they are perceived by others. Compassion rarely penetrates music, this structure, but consequence can. When the external world begins to contradict music, the internal fantasy that shields them, pressure builds. Under that pressure, music behavior sometimes reluctantly shifts. For a narcissist, apologizing music is not a moral or ethical act in the traditional sense. It is always strategic, calculated, and reactive. Their psychology is music-less, governed by an internalized conscience than by an ongoing loop of reward and threat. When you continue to tolerate mistreatment, when you remain emotionally available after being harmed, music, when you explain their behavior in the hope that they will finally understand, you inadvertently remove consequence. Music, you create an environment in which their actions cost them nothing. In such an environment, an apology music is unnecessary. There is no incentive to examine their behavior because music, the world, repeatedly confirms that their conduct is survivable, even profitable. When you continue to give attention, emotional labor, and accessibility without demanding accountability, the narcissist retains everything music without paying the price. There is no friction, no cost, no reason to self-reflect. Consequence, by music contrast, introduces discomfort and destabilizes their internal music system. It interrupts the fantasy that they can act without repercussion. Music, when access is removed, admiration withdrawn, and control, music challenged. The narcissistic individual experiences something far more threatening than guilt: the music collapse of supply. What they feel is not true remorse for the suffering they caused, music, but a deep anxiety about their own destabilization. Their identity is externally regulated. And when the external regulator disappears, music distress follows. That distress becomes the fertile ground in which an apology can grow. Not because they suddenly feel your pain, but because they are forced to confront their own vulnerability, their own fragility, and the reality that the world is not under their control. This is why pleading for an apology almost never works. When you beg for empathy, music, when you explain or defend your position, you are still signaling dependence. You, music, are still demonstrating that your emotional equilibrium is tied to their response. That is not a call to compassion. It is confirmation of leverage, proof, music, that their dominance remains intact. But when you withdraw engagement, music, when you stop explaining, defending, hoping, or chasing closure, you introduce music uncertainty. You place a cost on their behavior without speaking a single word. The silence itself becomes the message. Access music has conditions, and the new condition is respect. The apology that follows consequence is different from the one coerced through pleading. It is not born from a sudden understanding of your suffering, but from the profound experience of their own loss and music destabilization. This is uncomfortable, even unsettling, because it violates our moral intuition. We want to believe that morality drives behavior, but in many cases, truth is far more practical, pragmatic, and real. Music, we want to believe that human beings act ethically because they suddenly see the light. Music, that at some point a moral awakening will occur, illuminating the harm they have said and compelling them to make amends. Yet the deeper, often uncomfortable truth is that moral behavior is frequently stabilized not by sudden insight, but by structure, boundaries, music, and the presence of consequences. Even socially healthy people rely on music, external factors, to guide, constrain, and regulate behavior. For individuals with narcissistic tendencies, music, this reliance on consequence becomes nearly absolute. They are psychologically wired to avoid shame, protect a grandiose self-image, music, and maintain dominance over perception, which means that without consequence, the moral compass often remains dormant, and apologies are withheld indefinitely. What makes this particularly painful is that when the apology finally does arrive, it can feel hollow or ill-timed. Often it comes only after you have already detached. Music, after you have emotionally rebuilt yourself in the absence of their validation, after you have reclaimed your dignity and established music clear boundaries. The words may sound correct, even polished, but empty in substance. And yet, from a psychological standpoint, the occurrence music confirms a critical reality. Your self-respect altered the power dynamic. The change was not caused by convincing them of your worth, but because their music actions finally cost them something they valued. Consequence, in this sense, music is the agent of transformation, and your own growth stems from your ability to enforce it. Consequence, CE also produces a profound and subtle effect on you. By allowing the natural outcomes of their behavior to unfold without interference, music, you reorient your identity. You step out of the role of the one who waits, endures, or hopes for external validation, music, and into the role of a self-authoring individual who governs their own life. This shift can music be terrifying at first, because it forces you to confront the uncomfortable possibility that the apology may never come. You are then faced with a deeper, more powerful question. Do you want justice in the form of words or freedom in the form of boundaries? Music, choosing consequence over compassion as your guiding principle, means you no longer organize your life around the emotional limitations of another person, and that decision itself, music, creates the conditions for a healthier, more resilient self. The tragic paradox is that the moment you stop requiring the apology for your own music emotional stability is often the very moment it becomes possible. Not because the narcissistic individual music has evolved into a compassionate, empathetic being, but because the structure of the relationship has shifted. You are no longer available as a psychological music resource without cost, and the environment has changed. Behavior far more reliably than character responds to shifts, music and context. This is not cynicism, it is a pragmatic observation of human motivation and action, particularly within personality. Ties organized around control, image, and dominance, rather than mutuality and accountability. The reality is that structure, not sentiment, governs change. Silence is one of the most misunderstood forces in human relationships, often mistaken for passivity, weakness, or avoidance. In reality, silence can be a highly active psychological strategy, a deliberate withdrawal of energy from a dynamic that thrives on reaction. In relationships dominated by narcissistic control, noise, arguments, explanations, emotional outbursts, defenses, apologies, justifications is the currency. Music engagement, whether positive or negative, functions as supply that validates their sense of importance. Control is maintained not through physical dominance, but through the predictable pattern of psychological interaction. As long as you are reacting, the cycle persists. Silence, however, breaks music that cycle not through confrontation, but through absence, removing the psychological sustenance music that fuels their influence. A narcissistic personality depends on external engagement to regulate their music internal state. Their sense of self is fragile and unstable, requiring constant reinforcement through attention, admiration, fear, or emotional response. Even negative attention functions as supply because music proves they still have an impact on you. When you argue, you music validate their relevance. When you defend yourself, you acknowledge their judgment as authoritative. When you attempt to be understood, you hand them the power to define your reality. Silence deprives them of all of these, music removing confirmation, contradiction, and control simultaneously. It introduces a void that cannot be manipulated, twisted, or reshaped, creating a profound psychological destabilization. Music initially, silence often triggers escalation. The narcissistic individual may increase contact, music provoke conflict, issue accusations, or attempt to induce guilt. This is not chaos without cause. It is a predictable reaction to the sudden loss music of control. When their familiar tools cease to function, they intensify pressure, testing whether your silence is genuine or merely a pause. Music, each unreturned message, each unanswered provocation, each ignored insult gradually music erodes the reinforcement pattern they relied on. Over time, the system they use to regulate themselves stops producing predictable results. Music forcing them to confront a reality that their manipulations no longer dominate. Silence also reclaims authorship over your own nervous system. Music. When you stop reacting, you interrupt the stress-reward loop that kept you emotionally dependent. Music narcissistic relationships condition the body to associate unpredictability and tension with attachment. You become hypervigilant, music constantly scanning for their moods, their approval, or their next reaction. Silence disrupts that conditioning by removing the stimulus entirely. Music, initially the nervous system rebels against this withdrawal, producing anxiety, music restlessness, or even guilt. But over time, it allows you to regain emotional autonomy. The absence of engagement is not emptiness, it is empowerment, a recalibration of both your internal landscape and the external dynamics of the relationship. You may initially feel anxiety, guilt, restlessness, music, or an almost physical urge to respond. That urge is not love, nor is it proof that you are being too rigid or unforgiving. It is conditioning, the residue of a relationship pattern designed to keep you reactive and emotionally dependent. As silence continues, a profound shift music begins to occur. Your internal world gradually decouples from their music behavior. You stop structuring your emotional state around their reactions. Slowly, you begin to experience stretches of music, psychological quiet, where you are no longer managing damage, rehearsing arguments, or anticipating conflict. Music, this inner stillness, while deeply liberating for you, is profoundly threatening to the narcissistic dynamic because their sense of control only functions when something external is music actively being manipulated. When your inner life no longer responds to provocations, their psychological reach begins to shorten. The illusion of omnipotence that they maintain starts to crumble. To control is to believe that one's actions, music, reliably produce predictable ECTs in others. And when those effects vanish, music distress escalates. They may reinterpret your silence in ways that music serve their narrative as a challenge, a betrayal, or a test of loyalty. The specific interpretation matters music less than the fact that they are now reacting to you rather than the other way around. Gradually, the balance begins music to invert. What once felt like your dependence becomes their uncertainty. Your withdrawal, music, which might feel passive, is actually a form of strategic engagement that flips the relational power dynamic. Silence also exposes the asymmetry inherent in the relationship. Music, when you speak, defend yourself, or explain your perspective, you invest emotional energy that feeds the old structure of interaction. When you fall silent, that energetic flow becomes one-sided, creating a void that they cannot easily navigate. In response, they may attempt to re-enter the old pattern, talking into the void, performing remorse, offering partial apologies, or even manufacturing crises to provoke engagement. These behaviors are music, rarely genuine reflection. They are attempts to restore the old economy in which music, your attention, function as their stabilizer. Every moment you resist re-engaging reinforces a new structure, one in which your attention and validation are no longer automatic, and music access comes with boundaries and consequence. What makes silence so difficult is that it forces you to toll. Rate ambiguity. You are not immediately rewarded, validated, or reassured. You cannot control how they interpret your withdrawal, and you are confronted with the uncertainty of an outcome music that may never arrive. In this ambiguity, the old habits of overfunctioning, the impulse to clarify music, soften, or reassure often surface. The temptation is strong, not because it is wise, but because uncertainty feels intolerable. Yet music is precisely this tolerance of uncertainty that dismantles narcissistic music control. By refusing to be predictable, manageable, or scriptable, you fracture their sense of dominance. Silence is frequently misrepresented as punishment, music, but psychologically it is about self-preservation rather than retaliation. Music, you are not withdrawing to harm them. You are withdrawing to protect your identity from erosion. Narcissistic dynamics thrive on overexposure. You become transparent, repeatedly explaining yourself, revealing your doubts and wounds, and offering emotional data that can be used against you. Silence closes that channel. You become less readable, less available, and less manipulable. Over time, music, this absence, reshapes the power structure of the relationship without confrontation, argument, or speech. There is no accusation to deny, no emotional lever to exploit. Your calm, consistent absence becomes an immovable object in a music system previously driven by intrusion. The more you maintain silence, music, it becomes that their old methods of control no longer guarantee influence, access, music, or reaction, creating a destabilization that words alone could never achieve. Boundaries, which are often misunderstood as rules imposed on others, are in reality conditions you place on your own participation. A boundary does not instruct another person on what they must do. Instead, music clarifies what you will do, how you will respond, or what you will no longer tolerate. Music if a line is crossed. This distinction is crucial because narcissistic personalities respond minimally to moral appeals or requests. They interpret limits as challenges, music negotiation, or emotional manipulation, but they cannot ignore consistent music consequences. Boundaries, when combined with silence and consequence, create music, a structure that the narcissist cannot override, realigning power music without anger, confrontation, or compromise. Through this strategic withdrawal, you reclaim your autonomy, music protect your identity, and finally recalibrate a relationship that once demanded constant emotional labor. Music accountability does not arise from explanation, it arises from structure. In a narcissistic dynamic, your absence of firm, enforceable boundaries becomes the hidden architecture of their freedom. Every time you tolerate music disrespect, rationalize mistreatment, or remain present after being harmed, you are silently teaching them where the real limits. I. Not the limits you speak of, but the ones you actually enforce. Over time, verbal objections lose their significance because your behavior remains unchanged. The narcissistic individual learns a simple psychological equation. Your pain does not alter their access. Once this equation is established, music accountability effectively disappears because there is no cost attached to violation. Music boundaries, however, introduce cost, transforming abstract values like respect, music, and dignity into tangible consequences that shift the relational landscape. When a boundary is activated, something in the external environment changes. Access is reduced, privileges are withdrawn, emotional availability is limited, or participation in your life is restricted. This shift matters because narcissistic personalities are guided far more by external contingencies than by music, internalized ethics, or moral reasoning. They are acutely sensitive to where supply music flows and where it is cut off. The moment your boundary interrupts that flow, their behavior enters a new psychological field, a space where old patterns no longer function. At first, boundaries are often met with resistance, ridicule, or minimization. They may accuse you of being dramatic, selfish, or cruel, or attempt to reinterpret your limits' music as attacks. This reaction is not confusion, it is a test of your resolve. They are probing for inconsistency, seeking the point at which your persistence fractures a ND. The old pattern reemerges. Music. Every boundary that collapses under pressure reinforces their belief that persistence overrides limits. Every boundary that holds teaches them music, a hard, undeniable truth. Reality has shifted. What makes boundaries threatening is that they relocate power from the realm of emotional persuasion to music, the realm of personal choice. You are no longer attempting to convince them that you deserve music better. You behave as though better is a non-negotiable condition of participation in your life. The simple, firm stance, music, dismantles the central illusion that sustains the dynamic, the belief that they control both the terms of interaction and the definition of what is acceptable. A boundary communicates without argument that the rules have been rewritten. In this music context, accountability is not an internal moral awakening. It is an external behavioral adjustment. Music, once boundaries are consistently enforced, the narcissistic individual begins to experience a discrepancy between their expectations and outcomes. Music, what once produced immediate access, now produces distance. What once provoked engagement now produces silence. This misalignment generates psychological discomfort, not because they suddenly empathize with your suffering, but because the outcomes of their behavior no longer match their predictions. Music, that misalignment becomes the lever through which accountability emerges. Music from your persp. Active. Establishing boundaries feels destabilizing because it requires you to tolerate music, their displeasure, without attempting to repair it. Many people raised in chaotic or emotionally unsafe environments internalized early that their role was to restore harmony at any cost. Music and boundaries challenge this conditioning directly. Holding a boundary forces confrontation with grief and disappointment. When the other person reacts, music, with anger, withdrawal, or contempt rather than reflection, you must face the reality of who they are, not the person you, music, hope they might become. Accountability demands recognition of this harsh truth. No amount of patience, explanation, or sacrifice will transform the dynamic. Music, your only reliable power, is over your own participation, your own responses, and the structure you music enforce. For a narcissistic individual, the loss of unilateral access constitutes a narcissistic injury. Music. They perceive boundaries not as neutral parameters, but as personal rejection. Music, this perception intensifies their drive to dominate, circumvent, or manipulate music the limit, whether through charm, intimidation, or performative remorse. The difference, music now, is that a consistent boundary converts these maneuvers into observable data. Over time, you can distinguish between compliance in words, music, and genuine structural accountability. Compliance is temporary and fragile, collapsing the moment pressure returns or old patterns resurface. True accountability, by contrast, requires sustained behavioral change across both time, music, and context. Narcissistic personalities frequently test boundaries, probing to determine whether the limits you enforce are situational or structural. They may behave appropriately for a brief music period, offering what appears to be cooperation or remorse, only to slowly reintroduce old patterns music and see if your enforcement falters. Each successful test that breaks your boundaries restores the old hierarchy, while every boundary that withstands their pressure reinforces the new structure. This back and forth is deliberate and calculated, designed to map your limits and gauge whether your resolve is consistent. Boundaries also produce profound internal change, transforming your self-concept. You begin to see yourself not primarily as a reactor, constantly adjusting to their behavior, but as an agent of your own experience. Your identity reorganizes around what you permit rather than what you endure. This shift, though subtle, is quietly revolutionary. Music, you notice that your emotional stability no longer depends on whether they change, but on the consistency of your own responses. The chaos that once mirrored their volatility begins to settle as your internal rules gain clarity. Accountability in this context may be grudging, incomplete music, or framed as a concession rather than acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Yet it signifies a fundamental shift. The power dynamic itself, music, is restructuring. Behavior now adjusts because the environment demands it, not because they feel moral obligation. Detachment is often misinterpreted as indifference, music, coldness, or emotional failure. Psychologically, it is far more precise and music potent. Detachment represents the withdrawal of emotional dependency, not the absence of feeling. You may music still experience anger, sadness, disappointment, and even love, but these emotions no longer music dictate your choices or reactions. In narcissistic dynamics, leverage is built through emotional entanglement. The more reactive, invested, and dependent you are on their responses, the greater their control over music, your inner world. Over time, your emotional responses become predictable, and predictability forms the foundation of manipulation. Every provoked reaction reinforces music, the old power structure, giving them a reliable roadmap to influence, destabilize, music, or guide you. Detachment interrupts this pattern by making your inner state less accessible. What makes detachment music profoundly destabilizing is that it cannot be negotiated, debated, or coerced. You can argue against accusations, defend music against distortions, or attempt reconciliation through dialogue. But emotional investment cannot be argued back into existence. Music detachment creates a psychological vacuum where dominance previously operated. They may continue. To speak with authority, music, criticize with intensity, or perform concern. But the potency of these performances, music, diminishes when your nervous system no longer orients around their approval or disapproval. For you, music detachment begins as discomfort. You stop scanning their moods, anticipating conflict, music, or tailoring behavior to prevent upset. Anxiety emerges a natural response because your body has been conditioned to associate music vigilance with survival. Over time, as nothing catastrophic occurs from your withdrawal, your nervous system gradually recalibrates. Music, you learn that safety does not require constant attunement to another person's volatility. Music detachment allows you to recognize that much of what previously felt like connection was actually regulation. Music, you are not simply relating or communicating, you are managing, predicting, and adjusting to preserve emotional safety. The relational energy was not mutual, it was reactive, a system of control dressed as connection. Detachment disrupts this system, separating genuine engagement from imposed regulation, and reclaims the autonomy that was previously ceded. Your inner stability begins to anchor in yourself rather than in the unpredictable reactions of another. Stabilizing a narcissistic individual's identity often relies on your emotional feedback, your admiration, attention, outrage, or reassurance. When you detach, that regulatory function disappears. Why interpret this absence as abandonment, disrespect, music, or betrayal? But the deeper disturbance is the sudden lack of emotional anchoring. Without your responses, their internal instability cannot be outsourced music or managed externally. True leverage does not come from trying to make them understand. Music, it comes from no longer needing them to. The moment you stop attempting to control their perception of you, your behavior becomes less predictable and therefore music less manipulable. You no longer rush to defend your character, over-explain music, your feelings, or seek agreement as proof of reality. This withdrawal erodes one of the central instruments of narcissistic dominance, music, the power to define the narrative. Detachment also recalibrates your sense of self. Music, when your worth is no longer confirmed through their attention, you are forced to locate it internally. At first, this can feel hollow, even empty music, because you are removing a familiar source of affirmation before a new internal reference point has stabilized. Yet this temporary emptiness is music essential. It is the psychological space in which autonomy develops. From their perspective, detachment is infuriating music precisely because it cannot be coerced. Guilt may fail to move you, provocation may no longer provoke, charm may feel hollow, music and threats lose urgency. Each failed attempt to reignite your emotional participation, music, reinforces a stark, unavoidable truth.